Hi guys, hope you're doing okay and that you're not panicking too much. Now, before we focus on the life and times of Sylvia Plath, remember that for the 2 classes a week when you're watching the videos, you need to indicate that you're watching the videos at the designated times. So the times, of course, obviously are Wednesday and Thursday. Okay, so you need to make sure that I'm able to call the roll, that I can clearly see that you're watching the videos at those particular times. So all you have to do then is just in the comment section right here, and then I can tick you off. If you don't, then obviously I'll have to send your name to Miss Daly, and then various people will be called, and it just makes a complete and utter mess. Okay, so make sure that you do that. Okay, so remember that we're looking at 2 poems by Sylvia Plath and we're looking at 2 poems by Elizabeth Bishop. So today then, so for Wednesday's class, I'm just going to focus on the life and times of Sylvia Plath, the American poet. Okay, so we're going to look at some interesting points about her life, and we're going to look at some factual details that you will need to know, because the first point that we need to focus on in terms of Sylvia Plath's poetry is that she is a confessional poet. Now, what does confessional mean when it comes to poetry? Confessional means very simply that the poet focuses on very intense and extreme personal experiences. So there's a little idiom or phrase that we use in English. We say the poet wears her heart on her sleeve. So she's very honest, sometimes brutally honest, about what has happened in her life, about relationships. As we'll see, of course, Sylvia Plath focuses on her relationship with her father. She focuses on her relationship with her children. She focuses on her relationship with her husband, who becomes her estranged husband. They separate, Ted Hughes. She focuses on then obviously family themes as well, but she focuses on depression and she focuses on suicide. Okay, so there are a lot of kind of gritty and hard-hitting themes in her work, and that is why we use that particular term then, confessional poetry. Okay, so what do we know about Sylvia Plath then? Well, at the very beginning then we focus on the fact that she was born in Boston, Massachusetts. So Boston, remember, of course, is an American city on the East Coast, and she was born in 1932. Okay, so her parents then, her mother was Aurelia Schrober, and her father then was Otto Plath. And when they married, her father was actually 20 years older than her mother. And her father was an interesting man. He came from Germany and he moved to America basically to find work at the age of 15 and settled in New York and taught German. But then he developed an interest in science, particularly biology, and he eventually ended up becoming a professor of biology and German at Boston University. And he also became specifically what we call an entomologist. So that would be somebody who engages in the study of insects, specifically bees. He actually wrote an entire book on the bumblebee. So her father was much older than her mother, and her father was quite dictatorial. He was quite stern and quite strict. So she often felt, we'd say, intimidated by her father. So she had quite a difficult relationship with her father. She was close enough with her mother, but I don't think that she found her mother very emotional or very warm. Okay, Sylvia Plath herself had a brother, Warren, as well, but he's not mentioned that often. You can read sort of her letters and diaries and obviously her poetry as well. She doesn't really focus an awful lot on her brother. She focuses more on her father then, who was obviously a very inspirational figure and a very formidable, very powerful, and as I said, a dictatorial figure in her life. Okay, so she was born in 1932, but at the age of 8, her father passed away. Now remember that he was a professor, and basically he was quite an arrogant man. And he didn't realise that he was actually suffering quite extremely from diabetes. And the diabetes had a terrible effect on his body. Originally, he thought he was suffering from lung cancer, and he didn't go to the doctor and try to sort of treat himself and so on. And then he was diagnosed as diabetic, but he developed gangrene in one of his feet and then his legs, and it began to spread. So he ended up actually having a leg amputated as a result of that. And he died then when Sylvia Plath was 8, and she was devastated by that. And we can see that in quite a lot of her early poetry in particular. She writes extensively about her relationship with her father, her sense of loss, and even quite recently, in terms of various books and various research that has been done, there is the suggestion that she actually tried to take her own life, that she tried to commit suicide shortly after her father died, because she was so distressed and she found it so difficult, essentially. So we can see that there are at least 2, if not 3, suicide attempts when it comes to Sylvia Plath's life. Okay. Now, when she was a student, so at school and university, she was, and this is the key word they were going to use, she was a perfectionist. She had to be a grade A student. First of all, she felt that she would be letting down her parents, in particular her father, even though her father had passed away when she was only 8. So she felt as if she was going to disappoint her parents if she didn't excel at school, and she put a lot of pressure on herself. And a lot of people say, of course, that she did suffer a nervous breakdown. At the age of 20, she actually tried to take her own life by swallowing pills and then crawling underneath the house. You know, the way those American houses are usually made of wood, and it's almost as if they're raised, slightly raised. They're on kind of little plinths, or almost like stilts, and you can actually go underneath the bottom of the house. So she was found, I think, a day or a couple of days later, and then brought to hospital and obviously saved. Okay, so she went to university and she excelled there. She worked in New York on Mademoiselle magazine, very successful as well. But she always felt sort of inadequate and insecure, and I think that was because she placed such a burden on herself to be perfect in every way, to be perfect when it came to her academic life and then her personal life, to be the perfect daughter, to be the perfect wife and mother later on as well. Okay, so in the early 1950s then, she went to Cambridge University. So she was studying abroad, and she met Ted Hughes. And Ted Hughes was basically tall, dark and handsome, and she immediately fell in love with him. And she found him then to be sort of irresistible, essentially. But they weren't necessarily that compatible, or they weren't necessarily, we'd say, good for each other as well. Okay, so basically they met at a party and they decided to get together, and then they got married essentially then in June 1956. Okay, so they were in Cambridge together. Now, she was experimenting with writing poetry. She eventually ended up, of course, writing quite a number of volumes of poetry, and she also wrote a semi-autobiographical novel, The Bell Jar, as well. So he was also a poet. So there was a little bit of a kind of a rivalry or competition then between husband and wife when it came to the writing of poetry. And they obviously had a lot of their early poetry then published in kind of university magazines and so on. Okay, so they moved to America for a while, and then they came back, and they had been living in London, and they decided, of course, to move to Devon then, which is in the south of England. It's very picturesque, it's very beautiful, but it's also quite remote. And I think she felt sort of like lonely and isolated and cut off from her family and friends there. So essentially, they had 2 children together. So Frida was their daughter, and Nicholas then was their son. So basically then in 1960 then, April 1960, their daughter Frida then was born. But Sylvia Plath, I think, became quite depressed after that. She had a number of reasons essentially for becoming depressed. First of all, her physical health was failing. She had an appendectomy, so she had her appendix removed, and she also had a miscarriage around that particular time then as well. So she had a lot to contend with in terms of her physical health, and then her mental health was actually deteriorating as well. She felt very depressed, and nowadays people would say that she was actually suffering from bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, we know a lot more about it now. We knew very little about it back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s and 60s. So essentially it used to be called manic depression, where you would have extreme emotions or extreme emotional reactions. 1 minute you would be ecstatic, joyful, extremely happy, delighted with yourself and the world, and then the next minute then you'd be plunged down into the depths or pits of despair. essentially. So she found it very, very difficult, of course, to regulate her moods. And she was arguing quite a lot. There was a lot of trouble and strife then when it came to her marriage to Ted Hughes. And unfortunately, Ted Hughes was not that supportive of her. In terms of her poetry, he was to a degree, but in terms of emotional support, he really didn't offer that, and he was absent for long periods of time as well, because he was lecturing and he was travelling and he was writing and so on. And he was also having numerous affairs, essentially. So he was sleeping with a lot of his students, and he also had one particular affair with a close friend of theirs. So they were friendly with David Welville. He was a writer at that particular time, and his wife then was Asha Welville. And Ted Hughes started an affair basically under the nose of Sylvia Plath, because Sylvia Plath was friendly with both David and Asha at that particular time, and so was Ted Hughes. And she became more and more agitated as a result of that. And I think that Ted Hughes was trying to suggest to her that she was being paranoid, and then eventually he admitted that he was having an affair with their friend, and that he had also, of course, been unfaithful to Sylvia Plath throughout their marriage, especially towards the end of their marriage. So we know that in 1960 then Frida was born, and in 1962, that's January 1962, Nicholas, their son, was born, but they separated just months later. So you can find, of course, that Sylvia Plath obviously was in this farmhouse in Devon, very, very beautiful, but like I said, very isolating as well. So quite difficult for her to deal with the fallout then from the breakdown of her marriage, and then the fact, of course, that she was kind of physically frail, and mentally, of course, she found it very difficult then to deal with her depression and her bipolar disorder. She was given medication, but that actually exacerbated it, actually made her condition worse. And then Ted Hughes was kind of coming back into her life and would stay for a few nights and kind of give her hope, and then would simply leave again. So she was devastated every time they kind of reunited then, even though it was a short-lived experience. And then he would leave her, then he would simply depart, and she'd be on her own with her two children. So eventually she just found that unacceptable. So she moved back to London, and she moved into a small flat then in London with her two children. And she lived there and she tried to write, but it's kind of difficult when you have two small children, essentially, and you're trying to write poetry and you're trying to concentrate. And then essentially that particular winter then of 1962 was one of the worst on record, heavy snowfalls. She found it very difficult to make ends meet, to make enough money, of course. The children were coming down with quite a lot of colds and flus. They were miserable. She didn't even have enough money for heat or for food sometimes as well. Ted Hughes was just not a regular kind of visitor to her at that particular stage. He wasn't really helping out with the day-to-day chores and so on as well that she needed. And so in 1963 then, the early part of 1963, she ended up taking her own life. So she committed suicide. She actually took some sleeping pills and then sealed the door of her kitchen, making sure that her children were safe. Then she left bottles of milk with them. And that particular night then, she used the gas oven then to kill herself. And kind of strangely enough, Asha Welville then, who had moved in with Ted Hughes after the death of Sylvia Plath, ended up taking her own life. She actually took her own life in a similar manner and took the life of her child as well. So we can see then how the story of Sylvia Plath is plagued then by hardship, by despair, by depression, by hopelessness, really, when it comes to her situation. So her poetry then, as I said before, is an example of confessional poetry, and it's brutally honest and very, very sincere. So when we're reading through the poems, remember the first one is Poppies in July, and then we're reading the second one, Child, which focuses on her son Nicholas. We can see then how she bears her soul, how she tries then, of course, to express herself in a very realistic and honest and kind of matter-of-fact fashion. Okay, so you'll find quite a lot of her biographical details in her poetry. So the first poem, Poppies in July, is set in Devon itself, where she's just standing at the window, kind of imagine the kitchen window perhaps, looking out then at the poppies that are growing in the garden. The second poem then focuses on her child, her son, her second child, Nicholas, who was born, remember, in 1962. And actually, unfortunately, in 2009, Nicholas himself ended up taking his own life. So he became a marine biologist and had moved then to North America. And I think he was in Alaska when he actually committed suicide. So the only living member of that particular family, because Ted Hughes died a number of years ago from cancer, is Frida. So Frida, her daughter, is a writer, and she's actually an artist as well. She's an illustrator and artist. So what you need to do then for the next class is you need to have a look at Poppies in July, okay? And you need to kind of think about, we'd say, the central or key image or symbol of the poppy itself. So what does a poppy normally represent or symbolize? Because we will look at, we'd say, a positive image and then a negative image when it comes to poppies in July. And then think about the season, or think about the month of July and then the summer season and what that actually could represent or symbolize. When we first read the title, we assume, of course, that it's going to be a positive poem about the beauty of nature, the freshness of nature, the warmth of summer. So we assume perhaps that it's going to be optimistic or upbeat in some way. And it's only when we're reading through the poem then we realize how dark and gloomy and bleak this particular poem is. Also then when we're looking at the poem Child, we kind of think, well, this is going to be an affectionate poem, focusing on Plath's relationship with her young son, Nicholas, who's only about a year at that particular time. But then when we read through the poem, of course, we get the sense of Plath's deep unhappiness. And we also learn, of course, that this was the final poem that she wrote, that she composed before she died. So some people can see it then as a kind of suicide note as such, that she's writing then, of course, in response to the pain that she's feeling and the suffering that she's enduring, while also celebrating then the innocence and beauty of her young son, Nicholas. Okay, so hopefully in terms of these particular videos, what you can do is you can stop and start it, okay? You can also go back then maybe and replay any particular point that you've missed. But the whole point is that you really should be making and taking notes as you go through, and maybe even have, we say, a look at the video at least a couple of times so you can familiarize yourself with the poet and her background, and then how her experiences influence the two poems that we're going to have a look at. Okay, so I've sent you links then to the Google Groups, just basically giving you a reading or a recitation of Poppies in July and Child. So if you have a listen to the first one, and then obviously watch this particular video, and then watch the next video, which will be up then on Thursday, and I'll go through Poppies in July in detail. And then next week we can focus on the second poem, which is Child. Until then, guys, keep your spirits up, and remember you can email me any questions or queries or any difficulties that you're having, or you can post some comments then underneath the video as well. So take care until the next class. Bye.